I see Hypnagogia as the way that we explore human depth. It's the principal way we explore human depth. And so it's not just a state that happens sometimes between sleeping and waking. It is there, but it's much, much more than that. It's all those ways in which human depth comes to us, meets us, whether it's when we're asleep or waking up, or sometimes during the day too.
Keep watching to learn more.
Book 4 in the new Thinking Aloud dialogue series is Charles T. Tart, 70 Years of Exploring Consciousness and Parapsychology, now available on Amazon.
New Thinking Aloud is presented by the California Institute for Human Science, a fully accredited university offering distant learning graduate degrees that focus on mind, body, and spirit. The topics that we cover here. We are particularly excited to announce new degrees emphasizing parapsychology and the paranormal. Visit their website at cihs.edu. You can now download all 8 copies of the New Thinking Aloud magazine for free, or order beautiful printed copies. Go to newthinkingaloud.org.
Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we're going to be exploring hypnagogic consciousness. My guest is Adam Crabtree, who is a psychotherapist working in the Toronto, Canada area. He is the author of many books, including a magnificent bibliography of references on animal magnetism, early hypnosis, and psychical research. His other books include Multiple Man, Trance Zero, From Mesmer to Freud, Memoir of a Trance Therapist, Evolutionary Love, and his most recent book about which we'll be talking today, The Land of Hypnagogia. Once again, this is an internet interview, and now I'll switch over to the internet video. Welcome, Adam. It's a real pleasure to be with you once again.
It's great to be here, Jeff.
You've written a masterpiece, in my opinion, The Land of Hypnagogia, because it combines psychological insights with deep philosophical insights, and it's also an exploration of your own personal journey. Yeah, there's so much to say about it, but why don't we start by, for the benefit of our viewers, defining what the hypnagogic state is all about?
Traditionally, the hypnagogic has been written about since around the middle of the 19th century. And it has been defined from the beginning as a state, a sort of a twilight state between sleeping and waking. And that's the way it's been talked about over a long period of time from then until quite recently. And I myself have expanded that meaning. That's not the meaning that I use in my book. It's that plus much more, because I see hypnagogia as the way that we explore human depth. It's the principal way we explore human depth. And so it's not just a state that happens sometimes between sleeping and waking. It is there, but it's much, much more than that. It's all those ways in which human depth comes to us, meets us, whether it's when we're asleep or waking up, or sometimes during the day too. It shows itself, it manifests itself. And that is what I call the hypnagogic state. And the phenomena of the hypnagogic state I call hypnagogia.
Now, Carl Jung used a technique, I believe he called it active imagination. And it seems to me from his writings in the Red Book that he engaged in very extensive, ongoing conversations with a spiritual guide he called Philemon in the state of active imagination. And it strikes me that that would be very similar to what you're referring to here.
Well, it is. That's certainly one example of hypnagogia. I mean, hypnagogia pops up many different places in literature. People's unusual experiences, which they call visionary, or where they talk about visits, or where they talk about going on journeys. But it's not just when they're sleeping and dreaming. It's afterwards, but also on other occasions that cannot be pinned down, because hypnagogia is something that can be found any place in life, any time in life.
Well, for most people, meaning me, actually, it seems like a very fleeting, very elusive state. For the most part, I'm in my normal waking consciousness 99.999% of the time if I'm not asleep. And I experience that state of consciousess, for a few seconds, going into a sleeping and dreaming state. And that's pretty much it. But I gather that some people, and you're probably such a person, have cultivated the ability to hold and maintain that state.
Well, yes, and with me, it's quite natural, because I describe this in the book, but for me, it started when I was about 5 years old. In 1944, it started at a particular time. I can date it. I was just 5 years old, and I had read, or was reading, the Mandrake the Magician comic strip. At that time, the Mandrake Magician comic strip was quite popular in the papers, or what we called the funnies. You know, you go to the paper and you see the cartoons, and Mandrake was one of the strips that was there. And I remember an experience there that is described where Mandrake has found this solution that he can put on a mirror. And after he applies it to the mirror, he can walk through the mirror to the other side. And as I was reading this as a 5-year-old, what does a 5-year-old know after all? But as I was reading this, I suddenly became terrified. I felt like my whole life had been turned upside down. I felt like there was something where I thought the world was one way, it really was another way. And it was just like 3 little comic strips on a page, 3 little frames, you might say, of a comic strip on a page that did that to me. And that was the beginning for me of going into these states. That going through the mirror to the other side, Mandrake found a whole world there, which he called the mirror world. And people living there who were like the people on this side, the very same, except somewhat different, odd, weird on the other side. And he called them the mirror people. And their names were the names they have on this side, pronounced backwards. So that stuck with me ever since. And that was a long, long time ago, 1944. And that was the beginning of it. And I've had experiences that are unusual experiences. I call that hypnagogic, even though I wasn't waking up from sleep. It's that same region. And that was my initiation into hypnagogia and into the land of hypnagogia. And it never left me. And it left me shaken. And it left me thinking that this world and this experience of life that we have is not what we believe it to be. I know it may sound odd that a 5-year-old could have that experience, but I did. And ever since, I've been intrigued by exploring that land, which is what I consider human depth. I think some people have them quite commonly, but you have to be ready to be frightened. You have to be ready to see the strange and not turn away and run. And that's the way it was for me. I stayed with it. And we can profit from that if we pay attention. But most people run away. They don't want, it seems frightening. It just seems, and too confusing. But my life has been in some way repeating that experience over and over again, even though it involves fear and unusual kinds of experiences.
Well, now that you mention it, Adam, I am reminded, especially since I just said I never have a prolonged hypnagogic experience, that in my childhood, they were much more common. And I used to have, occasionally lengthy daydreams and very vivid ones, as a matter of fact. And I'm guessing that this access to this realm is much more common for children.
I think it is more common for children, partly because they are open to the unusual without immediately having to censor it and cut it off and run from it.
You describe this as a sort of fearful experience, but as I recall from my childhood, they were often very seductive. Like I would read certain fantasy stories. Raggedy Ann would hop on a dragon and fly through the air, and I would have fantasies of doing the same thing, flying on a dragon as a child, and they seem wonderful.
Hypnagogic images are a mixed bag. That is, they can have frightening things in them. And my initiation through Mandrake the Magician was frightening because it seemed to shake the whole world up. But many of the experiences are not frightening at all. They are just interesting. They are unusual. And they can lead somewhere because they are indications and expressions of human depth.
One of the points that you seem to make in your book, and I think it's an outgrowth of your experience reading the Mandrake comic book, is that there's a certain dread associated with experiencing this kind of depth.
It is true that some human depth experiences bring with them a sense of dread because they so shake up our ordinary familiar way of seeing the world that gives us comfort and feeling of stability and that everything's all right. Everything's all right with the heavens. But other experiences are not of that kind. It seems that with your experiences of hypnagogia as a child, many of them are pleasant. And many hypnagogic experiences are pleasant or intriguing or feeling like they open up things in a positive way, non-frightening way. But Nietzsche, who's one of my favorite people, as you know from reading my book, he saw the internet as, or the holy smokes, he saw human. The human abyss is what he called human depth, the abyss. And he said, be careful when you look into the abyss because the abyss is looking back at you. And he knew that people had this sense of awe, but also sense of fear and dread that kept them away from it.
Well, you quote a wonderful poem by Nietzsche where he says it's like going down into a well, but for superficial people, it may seem like going to hell.
Yes, that's right. He wrote this great poem. I think I can recite it. The poem is dig, or it starts this way. Where you're standing, dig out. Down below's the well. Let those who walk in darkness shout, down below there's hell. And what he's saying is, wherever you are, wherever you're standing, you can dig there and you'll get the well. You'll get the well of human depth. And it's only people who don't understand it, who are running from it, who believe that it's hell.
Well, that's rather profound because many people, when they think of hypnosis, when they think of depth psychology, there's a group of people who say you must avoid this at all costs. It's diabolic.
Yes, and that's such nonsense. and it keeps so much of the human race away from wonderful experiences, not just wonderful, also spine-tingling and world-shaking experiences that would be good for the human race to have more available to it.
In your book, The Land of Hypnagogia, you report on, I mean, it's sort of centered around the idea that you wrote this paper for an academic journal on psychological depth and the dread we have of exploring our own depths. The paper got rejected. And then you go into a deep personal exploration involving your own hypnagogic experiences as to what was the, I guess, underlying meaning. There was so much more to that paper that more than you had even written that became revealed to you as a result of this hypnagogic exploration.
Yes. What you're talking about now is what I call the second book of The Land of Hypnagogia. The first book is about hypnagogia itself, as we've been talking about it, as human death. The second book talks about my experience, where I have a property north of Toronto where I would go as a kind of retreat, and I have a lot of my library is there. And this article that I'd written about death had been rejected, and I had it bound and put in this, what I call a vertical file, and it was sitting on the wall in my study in this retreat that I call Stonewell. And I was there one day, and I looked up, and I saw this file that contained the rejected article on death, and it was sort of vibrating or something. It was odd. So I took it down and looked at it, and took out this bound copy of the rejected article, and I opened it up, and inside I saw, to my surprise, that there were these tunnels through the paper that had been made by a bookworm. And I was sort of shocked because I wasn't expecting it. And while I was looking at it, I noticed there was a movement up to my left, sort of vibration. And I realized that there was a cocoon there up to my left inside the cover of this book, and that was vibrating. And then out of this cocoon, something came and was there for a moment and then flew off. And I was sort of really shocked because none of this was expected by me. So to make a long story short, this is a moth that resulted from this bookworm eating my rejected article and digesting it, and digesting it when he converted into a moth. That moth had also that digested article in it, but unfortunately, it wasn't completed. There were things defective about my thinking in that article, and so the moth was feeling a kind of stomachache from this. And it came back to lecture me about my failures in my career, which are shown in my lack of understanding, a full understanding of depth. And in order to relieve itself of this kind of stomachache, it was going to give me lectures about my failures. And so the whole second book is about the lectures of the book moth. And these are lectures about me, my failures, and a lot of it has to do with different aspects of depth that I ignored.
It really is fascinating, and I have to assume that that section, book 2, there is a product of active imagination. And earlier you said you cannot direct hypnagogic experience, but I have the feeling that in some sense that exposition was directed. Am I wrong? How did that manifest?
Well, the way it works with me is this. Something comes to me out of the blue, and I pay attention to anything that comes out of the blue because there's something to be learned. And if I pay attention to it, it starts to develop. And if I don't turn away and keep paying attention to it and follow it where it goes, it develops into whatever it's going to become. Now, I don't direct that. I only give it an opportunity to develop. So it's my curiosity and my willingness to let the hypnagogic seeds grow and develop and become something that is involved.
My wife teaches courses on creativity, and she has an exercise that she calls holographic thinking with her students, where they can pick up any object, like it might be a pair of glasses or a paper clip or a mouse, a computer mouse, something like that, and have a conversation with it, and it will talk back to them. And any simple object has enormous depth. And in your case, the bookworm or book moth, as it was, had enormous insights into you, and then you began having a very extensive dialogue with this moth.
That's right. That's right. That's the whole second book of The Land of Hypnagogia. Yes. I must say that it was a lot of fun to see this come, to see the moth developing and saying these things, and really taking me to task about a lot of things, and I enjoyed it. Strangely enough, I enjoyed being taken to task because I was learning. But I also answered back sometimes if I felt there was something being missed or not right. It was a great dialogue.
The original paper that had been rejected was titled something like Depth and Dread.
Yes, that's right. That's right. I was trying to come to terms with it and laying emphasis on the dread part of it. I think that's part of the problem. That's too narrow. Too narrow. It isn't just dread. There are many other kinds of depth experiences and depth revelations that occur.
Well, you do have a sense, for example, in the existential literature where you have to get in touch with the most negative feelings in order to experience yourself authentically.
Well, yes, because the negative things is part of our shadow, part of what we're hiding from ourselves. It's a doorway to our depth. And if we're not going to go through that doorway because we don't want to face negative things, we're not going to ever discover things.
Of course, you worked as a depth psychologist yourself. You're very familiar with Freud, who pointed out what Freud would call the unconscious mind are basically the things about ourselves we don't want to know.
Yes, that's true. Freud saw that. And so he had a bit of an insight into human depth. It had started, as you know from my other lectures on some of your programs, it had started with Puisségur, the Marquis de Puisségur, who was a disciple of Mesmer. That's the guy that first opened the door. Freud was one of the people who went through a little ways. But in my opinion, he didn't go down very far. He discovered a certain depth, but a sort of superficial level of depth. And part of what I say in my book is a heavy criticism of modern psychodynamic psychotherapy and psychoanalysis that's put depth into a kind of handy straitjacket of models and concept and so forth. And I think this has been a terrible service to Western culture. The whole Western culture has suffered a kind of starvation because of this terrible narrow approach from Freud and others. Puisségur began something very wonderful, and it didn't have to go. It would ideally have gone much deeper, but Freud was one of the people who said, "This far and no farther. This is good. Let's do this and keep on doing it forever."
In fact, one might say that Freud's break with Jung was exactly over that issue.
I believe so. I believe that's the heart of it, because Jung was willing to go the distance.
But even Jung, when he engaged in his active imagination explorations, hypnagogic explorations, encountered the equivalent, I'd have to say, of a spiritual teacher, Philemon, from whom I gather Jung derived most of his theoretical ideas. Jung was afraid of descending into madness. Some people suggest that he did.
Yes, he was afraid of that, and Tony Wolff, who he had been working with and who became his companion, helped keep him out of madness, helped keep him enough in this world to be able to learn new things, but not become mad.
Back to Hypnagogia, at one point you suggested that you can't really direct it, but at another point you said there is a way of working with it, that you can listen to it. You can kind of, I get the feeling that maybe you can massage it or prod it, or by paying attention to it, you can, for example, it seems pretty clear to me, you engage in a very extensive hypnagogic conversation with this book moth.
Yes, it's true that my dialogue with the book moth was very extensive, and it expanded tremendously in a way that really is so interesting to me. I'm like a participant. I'm an onlooker. I'm not a creator of this stuff, okay? It creates itself, and it manifests itself to me. So it's great to be an observer of this.
Rudolf Steiner, who was both a philosopher and an esoteric thinker, maintains that every thought we have is a spiritual entity. Now, I'm under the impression from your book that you don't want to go that far as to say become a spiritualist, but you come right up to the edge there.
I hope that I do more than just come to the edge. If you mean by spiritualism, communication with the dead and that sort of thing, no, I found really eventually quite boring. Not that I find it unbelievable, but I find it really not very deep at all. And so, although I explored that avenue for a few years of my life, it wasn't satisfying to me. Spiritualism as a movement, that is.
Well, of course, you wrote extensively about the relationship between mesmerism and psychical research, and one might say that the spiritualist movement was something of one of the several outgrowths of that.
Absolutely. Spiritualism historically came right out of mesmerism with other things added. Yes, it did.
What Steiner is suggesting is that every thought is, in effect, a spiritual entity. It doesn't have to be a ghost or a deceased person. That an idea, like the idea of the book moth itself, has spiritual potency.
To me, ideas in the West have too much of a sense of abstraction, concepts, and so forth. I like the notion of images being endlessly fruitful, which can expand in every direction. But of course, they have a rational or an intellectual dimension to them, these images.
I'd like to go back to one of the very first experiences that you describe in your book about hypnagogia, where, if I recall correctly, you're looking at yourself in the mirror, much like, I guess, Mandrake looked into the mirror. And you found yourself drifting into a realm where there was a cardboard man who was having a conversation with somebody named Brian. And you had this sense that Brian referred to you, of all things, and then it all disappeared. It was a lot of vivid imagery, but it didn't seem to necessarily go anywhere.
Well, to me, it was a very important experience. Now, this happened at night when I got up to go to the bathroom, believe it or not. So I'd been sleeping deeply, and I was half asleep when I went to the bathroom. And I realized I stood in front of the mirror and was looking at in the bathroom mirror, and I closed my eyes, and I realized what was going on in my mind as I was standing there was totally different from my ordinary way of thinking. And if I opened my eyes, I was back in ordinary reality again. So I closed my eyes, And I found myself standing on the edge of a hillside, very gradually sloping up and away in every possible direction, almost in an infinite directions. And I was looking at this hillside, and it was like there were events happening all over the sides of this hillside, things going on, things occurring like little pieces of time, little pieces of action. And as I was watching this, I looked down, and between me and this hillside was a very flimsy fence. And to my right, I saw two figures standing, one on one side of the fence and one on my side of the fence. And the one on the hillside side of the fence looked like a cardboard figure. If you'd laminate 10 thicknesses of cardboard and then carve it off into a shape that looked something like a person, and the eye was simply a hole punched through the cardboard. And this thing was standing there talking to the person on this side of the fence. And that person, I somehow knew that their name was Brian. And this cardboard figure was saying to Brian, he was saying, "Now, Brian, you think you know a lot of things, but in fact, you really don't know that much." And as I was standing there, seeing that and hearing this little conversation, to my left was this little man that was watching all that was going on, and he was repeating everything word for word and literally over and over again ad nauseum. And I just got so sick of this little man repeating everything endlessly. And that was that point I opened my eyes. I was in my bathroom in front of my mirror. And that was a hypnagogic experience without doubt. And to me, that landscape that was opened up in that experience, we have that in us all the time. That's there. I mean, for everybody, it's a different landscape, and it's populated by different things on that hillside. But it's always alive and happening. And in a way, it's outside of time, although these little pieces of events are within their own time.
I get the feeling from your description that the fence there with the two figures, I think one on each side of the fence, it seemed to represent the boundary between our normal external world and this other realm, the land of Hypnagogia.
Yes, you're right. And I talk about something in the first book of the Land of Hypnagogia called The Enchanted Boundary. And this is taken from a book, actually a psychical research book called The Enchanted Boundary. And there's this wonderful description of if you cross this boundary, like the knights would cross this boundary with full armor and horses and power. And when they crossed the boundary, it all caved in on them. Their armor was full of cracks, and their horses became hardly able to walk along the path. And everything changed when you crossed that boundary, because the author says, because lo, it was an enchanted boundary. And I think we have an enchanted boundary between the land of Hypnagogia and the land of the ordinary. And when you go across that boundary and cross into the land of Hypnagogia, the tools that you use to understand this world, the world of the ordinary, don't apply. They don't work. You have to change your tools. You have to let it teach itself. You can't go after it and corral it.
Now, you report a number of other hypnagogic experiences in your book, and probably the most fascinating comes at the end, where you sort of dive into the well we were speaking of earlier, with Nietzsche as your companion and guide. And in one such experience, it did seem dreadful. It was like you were in a pit. You were on trial, and everybody understood you were guilty. You were going to be executed. It must have been like an encounter with a state of absolute humiliation.
Absolute humiliation, hopelessness, no way out, because everybody was against me, even my so-called friends. Now, I say me. It was me in the pit, but in fact, I was also the observer of this whole scene. I was both things. And so I wasn't, in my journey down there, I wasn't afraid. But me in the pit was certainly terrified and hopeless, yes.
So you had a sense of almost like bilocation.
Yes, and that's I experience that every day. I experience, you might say, an observer part of me all the time that's present with everything I do, observing what I do, and I'm doing them, so I'm there, but also this observer is separate and unaffected. Unaffected. Doesn't participate in the emotion, it just observes. And this is something that actually reminds me of something that my friend Michael Murphy of Esalen would talk about, which is, he said there is this poem in Hindu culture of two birds on a tree, and the tree of life. And on that, they're on branches, and the one bird eats of the fruit of the tree, and the other eats not. And I think that observer is the one that eats not, and the other bird is the one that lives life.
And as I recall, in this hypnagogic experience down in the well, you are condemned, you're guilty of committing a horrible crime, you're executed, but then the scene changes and you are into one of the most beautiful, seductive, fascinating places one could ever imagine, a carnival of the senses. And you also had a sense that this was a very dangerous place.
It was, because it was so wonderful. These were all the productions of the human community over all of the ages gathered together and showing themselves in all their glory, and its real glory and its true accomplishment of the human race. So it's wonderful to go there and see these things. But if you stay there, you can't go on. You can't learn further. You're stuck. And so it's like a temptation to stay there and just go on enjoying it. And I recognized that as I approached this, that it was a temptation like a siren call. And I had to avoid going there and getting stuck there.
It sort of reminded me of academia, where if you're a college student, you're exposed to all the wisdom of the human community, or really, to be accurate, all the knowledge, not so much all the wisdom. And but it's very seductive. And furthermore, as a college student, you have all sorts of other pleasures that are available to you that you never had before when you were living in your parents' home. And it can become a place where people get stuck in their lives because it's so pleasurable and infinitely complex.
Yes, I think that this place that's so seductive is seductive because the things that it contains are real. They're real accomplishments. They really are interesting. But the problem is to get stuck there and go no deeper. We can do that, as you say. You can do that in academia too. And I think that Freud did that. He was very fascinated by his accomplishments and others in related matters of his profession. And he got stuck there, and he went no further.
One might say this is true of the profession of psychology as a whole. There are enormous insights. Psychology as a discipline, even depth psychology, has been very crucial in 20th century, 21st century culture. And at the same time, there's so much further that we really need to go if we're going to address the problems we face.
That is well put. That's exactly the way I see it. There was a great deal of accomplishment there, and I've written my own academic articles and treatises on why Puigcer's discovery of artificial somnambulism opened up depth to the whole of the Western world, which became our culture, and it's full of wonders. But it's only part of the way down. It's so easy just to think we've got it now, and we don't.
Well, in your hypnagogic explorations with Nietzsche, after you managed to escape from this very seductive realm full of all wonders and all knowledge, as I recall, then you encounter another boundary. In fact, I think you describe it as more than just a boundary, but a divide.
That's right. You keep on going further into the depths, or I kept on going further into the depths. And actually, I come to a whole region called home, the feeling of home, and the wonderful sense that I found a home that I knew about, that I had been there. There was a wonderful place, and there were my people, and we understood each other. And I was enjoying that so greatly. This is an actual experience I've had, and the experience of home. But beyond that experience of home, to continue down with something else. It was something inexpressible and something very, very unknown. And that's right, not just the boundary, but it's a divide. And if you go across that divide, I felt, if you go across that divide in the world, in the depth, you may never come back. That is, it would actually take you somewhere, and whatever you were before is gone, and you are somewhere else, probably doing much better. But there was no return. That was my feeling.
You know, it does remind me of the reports of people who have near-death experiences. They do talk about this feeling of being at home, the place where they always belonged, but then they do suggest that there's further evolution beyond that, and an evolution of sort of merging with the infinite, losing individual identity completely.
Yes. I think they're onto something there. I really do. I think that corresponds quite well to what happened to me as I explored the depth in this journey with Nietzsche.
There's a phrase that I've heard used in different contexts, the idea of the psychonaut, the person who is exploring the landscape of the psyche. And it seems to me that through this hypnagogic exploration, that's precisely what you're doing. I've often thought that maybe lucid dreaming was the way to do it, but obviously, or I assume that these experiences that you report are not via lucid dreaming at all. They're via some other related process.
Absolutely, and they're very accessible. That doesn't mean that I can produce them, but I can make them accessible, and I can do things that encourage their coming to me, so you don't have to wait for dreams. They can happen anytime.
I also have a sense from your explorations, Adam, that this is not particularly culturally dependent or dependent on some sort of a religious, theological structure. You're really...
I think religions have taken us away from depth because they've tried to take us away from our fear of depth, which is what we wanted. We wanted religions to make us feel safe and not fearful. But as a result, we've lost contact with depth.
Well, this has been a wonderful exploration, Adam, and I'm really delighted because it seems to me that what you are mapping out actually is an excellent approach to the whole question of this endeavor that I would characterize as psychonauts, that there's so much there in the human psyche, and of course your experience was very unique to yourself, but at the same time, it strikes me as being very universal.
I believe that it is universal and unique. I think we are all singularities and never repeat, but we all are, so it's universal.
Well, Adam Crabtree, thank you so much for being with me. It's been a great pleasure to connect with you after several years since we were last together, and I look forward to our next conversation about Nietzsche.
So do I, and thank you very much for the invitation, and I look forward to that one too.
I highly recommend that our viewers take a look at your book, The Land of Hypnagogia. And for those of you watching, thank you for being with us.
4 in the new Thinking Aloud dialogue series is Charles T. Tart, 70 Years of Exploring Consciousness and Parapsychology, now available on Amazon.
New Thinking Aloud is presented by the California Institute for Human Science, a fully accredited university offering distant learning graduate degrees that focus on mind, body, and spirit. The topics that we cover here. We are particularly excited to announce new degrees emphasizing parapsychology and the paranormal. Visit their website at cihs.edu. You can now download all 8 copies of the New Thinking Aloud magazine for free, or order beautiful printed copies. Go to newthinkingaloud.org. For early access to our videos and live stream events, sign up for our free weekly newsletter at newthinkingaloud.org.